Hey gang, welcome to Big Brother and the Hodling Company, a podcast about music and Web3 and trying to fend off Big Brother. I'm Makika Voice. Today I spoke with Austin Robey, who's one of today's champions of platform cooperativism and collective internet culture. Austin's the co-founder of Ample, which is a web-based platform for direct community support of musicians that formed as a collectively owned co-op. He's also part of the founding squad for Metalabel, which is an organization that builds resources, tools, and infrastructure for collectives and creative communities, often within the Web3 space. We talked about elevating the concept of collective ownership as a cultural value, as well as his evolving perspective on the role of venture capital and a love for music whose story's beginnings includes bringing a Smashing Pumpkins mixtape to the third grade. Hope you all enjoyed the conversation. Here we go. All right, hey Austin, great to have you here.
Hey, good to be here.
As always, I like to start at the beginning and just get a sense of where you grew up, kind of your background, and when your relationship with music started.
I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and which is it's like a metal town. There's a lot of Tejano music and Mexican culture there too, and country.
Interesting
I
combination.
grew up listening to, my mom listens to like country radio, so I also just weirdly know a lot of country songs and lyrics. And my relationship to music, I remember I was one of the first people burning CDs for people, so I learned how to make tapes and burn CDs. So I feel like that was a source of pride for me for just like tinkering and learning how to do that. I made a Smashing Pumpkins cassette mixtape and brought it to third grade class to play, and was in eighth grade. I had one punk friend, his name is Max. So in our reading class, he would wear like Operation Ivy and Dead Kennedys and No Effects shirts. I think he had a cool stepdad that introduced him to this
Cool.
stuff, and he gave me a Dead Kennedys cassette tape. This makes me sound really old, but I think I'm 34. I don't remember when this was, like 2002, something like
Nice.
that, 2001. And I remember playing it and just being like repulsed by it. I was like, this is awful. This is terrible. And then listening to it a third time and a fourth time and being like, oh, this is really cool. Kind of like how unpalatable it is to people. It's like a refined taste or something. And so, yeah, I feel like I need to reach out to Max, give him a shout out, because I just remember that being like very influential for me. I was in a band in high school. We played shows for high school friends. We weren't good at all, but it was just fun. And then moved to New York to go to college. I studied architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. It's like a art and design school. And then found myself in Brooklyn where there was so much DIY activity happening in the late aughts, like early tens. There's so much stuff happening, and so that was just a source of energy. I think it's a lot of kind of the indie sleaze activity and just like DIY venues popping up all over. It's like a petri dish or whack-a-mole. Like they would just show up and get shut down, and then another one would show up again. And so it felt like that movement and that time, even though I think you're hard pressed to find any like long-standing, legendary, or highly influential bands that came out of Brooklyn in that time, I still feel like it was like a important time. So I feel like it influenced me quite a bit for the kinds of like the attitude behind it, which is you don't need to ask for permission. You can start your own thing. You don't have to be credentialed to start a venue or to be booking shows. There was like an ongoing DIY series called Bikes in the Kitchen, which was just this guy Carlos who had bikes in his kitchen would throw shows in his kitchen, or someone
That's
started
amazing.
a venue called Above the Auto Parts Store because it was just like a place above an auto parts store.
Hmm.
And I just like love that energy. So I feel like that's what felt cool to me about discovering like a music scene in New York.
Yeah, so many good memories in that journey. I remember the first time I heard Too Drunk to Fuck, and I think it was around like in a similar age where I discovered the Dead Kennedys. I think it was like a random LimeWire download or something. And yeah, I remember it being just off the wall and like everything against what I had been raised. So there's something so in your face about it that you listen to it a few times and you're drawn to the energy of it. It's raw.
Yeah, and that was like when Bush was president during the Iraq War.
Right.
So like Jello Biafra also had a bunch of political like podcast
Right.
type talks that you could download off of LimeWire, and no effects being this was just like 13-year-old me just thinking it was the the coolest stuff. But then there weren't many punk people at my high school. It was like I never really. I have a feeling of feeling like I missed out a bit because I know people that I know now that had a lot more people that were into their specific music or had a scene in high school, and I didn't really. There wasn't really that at my high school, so I didn't really like necessarily find like a tribe that was oriented around music
Yeah.
until later.
Yeah. Same. Yeah. In my high school, it was a very small town in Minnesota, and it was also a lot of country music and like pop music, maybe some new metal here or there, but that was about it. It was a similar journey it took moving to New York and getting into the DIY scene. I remember going to a rave in the back of a Crown Chicken one time. This is amazing. You like come out to the Crown Chicken, people are just getting chicken. And then you go through a door, and all of a sudden you're in a rave, and there's 40 people packed into this back room. That's the kind of magic that brings people together, that kind of spirit.
Love that.
So I'm curious. So after you studied architecture, you were diving into some of the DIY scenes in Brooklyn. When did Ampled come about? And I know I've known about Ampled for a long time. First, if you could talk a little bit about what it is and how it emerged. And it's always been committed to staying 100% artisan worker owned. And I think that's not something that a lot of startups do. I'm curious, like how you were exposed to things like co-ops and that ideology, and what about it allured you that you wanted to commit to this path?
Ample came together with it's like a few people at the start, and it became a very collaborative project with a lot of contributors and people helping with it. Part of the core group of people helping start it was Colin Lewis and Ryan Deshawn, and all people that have had history playing in bands as well, and friends playing music. And it really just yeah started as conversations of one observing this Patreon like model as something that is seems relatively better than other models of just direct patronage that is more reliant on this kind of like emotional reward that you get from just directly supporting or having a direct relationship with an artist. Yeah, it's just what if we just did something like this that people didn't get nerd chills like using like Patreon, just like what would it look like to make something that was like structurally unique or could like was trustworthy, but not trustworthy because you could point to people and say it was like trustworthy beyond relying on somebody's goodwill or personality or like promises, even just as something that like you could point to and being saying this is structured differently. So it for us starting it, we treated it like a research project for a long time. Just like how could this work? And early on, landing on this inspiration of shared ownership, and that's basically as far as that idea first went. We're just like, oh, that would be cool. That feels like it would align interests pretty well. How do you do that? And then it ended up just being a long idea maze of figuring out not only what is possible, but what is maybe practical. And I think we just went back and forth and just really landed on cooperatives and digging much deeper into, oh, yeah, cooperatives are a very interesting model. I had only really heard of co-ops just from knowing people in Brooklyn that were members of the Park Slope Food Co-op and
Mm,
would work at an hour shift every month. And I
mm,
just thought that sounded so cool to be like a part of a community like that. And just kept digging. And eventually we just threw the practicality concerns out the window. We just said, oh, yeah, this model seems like the best one. We have no idea how to fundraise for it. We have no idea how to structure it. There's very little precedence for how anything like this could work, and there's no exit built in. So there's no real way to have any outsized financial gain from this, but let's just go with this. It feels right. And so that was just the compass of the project, which was like,
mm.
what feels right to us. I devoured so many Fred Wilson blogs of how to start a startup and then internalize that, and then just pretty much threw all the advice out the window and just ended up just trusting our guts and just saying what feels right, like which yeah, like what feels good to us was the ultimate kind of litmus test for making any decision.
After you decided on the co-op model as, as being the structure that felt right for you to build Ampled around, did you find that when you started talking to artists and started to cultivate community, that that messaging resonated? Did you find that artists resonated with the fact that you were a co-op? And was it very easy to understand like the distinction between building out a profile and creating content at a place like Ampled versus doing it at a place like Patreon, where the platform is taking a cut of your relationship with the people? Was that like very easy for people to understand at first?
Yes and no. So I remember that being a goal, which was to say, could we go to a loud bar and explain this and someone would understand if they've had two drinks?
That's
Um,
a great way to think about it.
and that's pretty much one of the reasons why we threw out some of the more complicated models, which would include like vesting restricted stock units or
Hmm.
something like that. How do you
Mhm.
explain that? No chance. So the model is more easy to understand, which is to say, yeah, you join and you get 10 supporters and you become a co-owner and you
Hmm.
get a vote and you get one share. And that just is way easier to understand conceptually. So there is like this, I think that is something that is intuitively understandable. It depends on who you're talking to, of how excited they get about that. So some people, yes, some people it has drawn people in. I think the tricky part of understanding why that's important is you it implies an understanding of existing startup and existing startup funding and ownership models, which like is not an area of fluency that most musicians care about. So it required outlining how startups even work, saying there's multiple rounds of funding, and each round of funding typically give up maybe 10 or 15% or more of a company, and you keep doing that, and then you end up with investor ownership. And when investors own a platform rather than the people that rely on it, if there's a difference between what a decision that may have a conflict between the interest of one versus the other, then the ownership wins. That, yeah, there was a level of education of just explaining why ownership is important. And it's a big, I'd say we're not fully there yet of it being a cultural value that is driving a lot of decisions. So we often just ask the question of who owns it. And it occurs to people that that's a question that they've never asked before.
Hmm.
Who owns Spotify? Who owns Bandcamp? So I think these are questions that's not often asked. So it's in some ways difficult to clarify a solution when people don't understand it as a problem yet. However, I think there is a part of us that understands this intuitively of collective ownerships is like a real solution for our own kind of collective agency and dignity and capturing value that is being extracted from us. It's a long-term challenge. How do you even elevate this as a cultural value? So I think some people identify with it very strongly, and other people, I think, just have never even considered it. So it's part of the challenge.
Yeah, and ever since then, you certainly have elevated it as a cultural value, and that's become an, this has become an idea that you have become a champion of in terms of talking about collective ownership in various capacities. And I'm curious to hear, as you dove into building around this cooperative structure, how did your interest and your knowledge base of this grow and expand into something that you really wanted to pursue across the organizations that you've been part of ever since then?
I think like one of the reasons to first explore it was like from the mindset of a kind of David and Goliath
Hmm.
type, like almost like a positioning. If we're going to make something, why would anyone care? Like it has to be different.
Hmm.
And it just seemed at first, oh, this makes sense. This would be more fair. I like how this sounds. And maybe that's the reason why people would sign up and join in the first place. Maybe that's just the reason for this existing. The collective ownership is fundamentally like an answer to so many problems today of wealth inequality. I think it's a core part of economic justice, social justice, racial justice. This is ownership, like looking, researching more, being like, this is the answer for economic power and political power. And it's possible just by joining together. That if you can imagine a like collectively owned or cooperative version of any kind of service, it would be, I think, a pretty bright future if there was a competitive version of any service that you could actually have a say or a voice or a be able to capture the value that you are generating as part of this enterprise. So yeah, I think like my own journey or all of us at Ample just saw this, oh, this is interesting to this is something that could have much wider implications for a broader online creative ecosystem. And I think that we saw the project as like a vessel for this in a way, where we saw a kind of cultural impact of elevating values as being distinct from how much money is running through the platform,
Hmm.
and saw as like a probably the biggest impact that we could make is just by demonstrating this model in some way. And if we could make a small dent in the way people viewed how platforms can work or how, like, what purpose they serve, if you could just move Overton window just slightly
Hmm.
so that people could just be slightly more imaginative about what a platform could be, then that as a project grew for us to think about that like just as much, if not more, as the actual kind of operations of the platform itself.
Cool. I love that. Yeah, it feels the route that once you go down, just asking that question, who owns it, it can really reframe your entire perspective of the way the world works. I would use an example like who owns Spotify? And we've accepted this narrative of the wealthy startup founder. Looking at Daniel Ek, he made like a whatever it was, like $3 billion, like like he made an offer for some ungodly amount of money to buy like a Premier League team. And at the same time, people also aren't quite aware of the plight of the artist and how Spotify really isn't making them any money, but they're still willing to tolerate an action like that where one person who owns this platform, just from that ownership, is able to acquire that much wealth and place it elsewhere, not actually serving the constituents of the platform, so to speak.
We made like an Instagram gallery or whatever it's called when you have multiple pictures in one, a carousel, yeah, of the who owns Spotify and just showed all the multinational investment banks and
Oh, yeah.
the percentage shares and at their current value, how many streams it would take
Wow.
to make up that much money. And it's basically streaming in since before prehistory began. It's
Jesus.
that's basically what it equals. And yeah, I also had written an op-ed for Music Ally
Right.
about
Yeah.
artist ownership of Spotify, just because I saw again a lot of artists say asking for more fractions of a cent per play. And I just thought that was like the not the right answer. It just seemed like this feudal acceptance of the model itself.
Mm,
And I kind of, so the op-ed argues for ways to achieve governance representation at Spotify or an artist creation of an artist trust that holds Spotify stock
mm,
ownership. So we're really not there yet with this being something that even approaches a set of demands or being top of mind for artists, but I think
right.
that it should be. And I think if you ask the question of who owns it, you know where to direct your grievances much more effectively. If
Yeah.
you're adding Spotify on Twitter, I think that's less effective than going to, what's it, Bailey Giffords? I forgot the, like, one of the biggest shareholders. If you just go in front of their offices
Mm,
and embarrass them
mm,
and point out their own kind of corporate responsibility text from their website
right.
and put it in front of them, then I think like you're more likely to affect Spotify by going to the owners than just creating a kind of like spectacle. And last year, I remember having a pretty unpopular opinion that was critical of Bandcamp, which is to say, if you really like a service, I know Bandcamp got a lot of goodwill during Bandcamp Fridays during COVID, but my reservations were like, this is a company that's still just largely owned by two white guys. I don't see this as like a sterling example of an equitable vision of the future. And you're still just relying on a very small group of people to steward the values of independent music. And I think that's just such a mistake of the entire independent music community to just feed that trust to individuals that could have very lucrative reasons to sell them out. And and then they did. They sold Bandcamp to Epic Games, who owns Fortnite, and did it in a way where they never had any town hall.
Mm,
There was never any real communication except for a blog after the
mm,
fact. And that to me shows very little respect for the community,
mm,
shows very little reason, or it shows almost no need for accountability.
mm,
And I fault the broader independent music community in not holding them accountable more.
mm,
And even if they're relatively much better than something like Spotify, I still think you have to ask the right questions about governance, like real governance power in an organization, just to even have some kind of level of bidirectional accountability. And or else we're just going to continue to lose things that are meaningful. So in some ways, even I think like it could have been more beneficial to the broader independent music community to direct pressure towards Bandcamp instead of Spotify, which
right.
hasn't moved at all. But what you could have done was imagine a Bandcamp where instead of the founders selling it to a bigger company, transition it to a worker-owned
Right.
cooperative.
Right. Yeah, like an exit to community. Yeah, that would be incredible. And I think that's a really good example. And I remember them giving the sort of the age old excuse or the age old rationale of being purchased by this huge company that we're going to maintain our independence and now we have access to all of these resources to help the communities that we serve. But from what I can tell, I haven't seen too significant of an impact from having access to that additional capital to serve their community in any more significant of a way. I don't know if you have.
No, I don't think people have seen much meaningful engagement, but it could be that I'm not on the newsletter and I don't see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm admittedly not on the Bandcamp newsletter either. Yeah. But it feels like a good segue into a question I have about something that is rather topical over the past few days. So I was thinking before a conversation about the time when we first connected, and I think I first saw your name in the piece that you wrote for the Creative Independent, writing about how to start a co-op. And in that piece, you pushed back on kind of the traditional venture capital worldview, which you said views platforms as a financial arbitrage machine, when instead it should be more trying to build sustainable organizations that serve as permanent vehicles for community prosperity, is how you wrote it, which is a lovely way to think about it, I think. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on that worldview in the context of the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. I've seen some sensationalist pieces about like this is the death of crypto and Web3. And one thing that you and I also talked about at one point was when Friends with Benefits, aka FWB, which for people who don't know is a decentralized autonomous organization, when that community accepted some money from Andreessen Horowitz's A16Z and a few other funds, became entrenched in that VC model in a different way. They did it in a different way. We talked about that. And in some ways, it set the tone because now lots and lots of organizations within Web3 continue to get their capital from venture capitalists. And I'm curious, to get a sense if you think something like decentralization can work with venture capital in any way, and are they inherently incompatible, or is there a way that they can find common ground and utilize the huge amounts of capital that are in that space? And then I'm curious also if what's happening with Silicon Valley Bank, if and how you think it affects the macro outlook for Web3's future.
Yeah, I think Silicon Valley Bank collapse maybe feels a little bit separate, but I think my views on venture capital have actually probably evolved and become a little more nuanced. When, Ample is a project that I think like it felt important for that project to have a kind of ideologically pure approach, which is and there are no investor owners. And that required us, we raised a tiny, like a little bit of money, I think $90,000 total ever in the history of the project. And that from tech standards is like not much at all,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's very expensive to build things and be competitive at all. And that relied on us basically inventing our own term sheets, which were based on revenue based loans, which did not give any ownership and were honestly required someone to really want the project to succeed more than to get a real return on their money. Like we Ample did not solve this problem. In 2019, when I wrote that How to Start a Cooperative piece for Creative Independent, I said something like venture capitalists are the smartest idiots on the planet and like they have like the wrong point of view and we don't need them. We don't need their worldview. We can just do things our own way. And I still think that it's largely true. There's a lot of kind of biases towards one way to do things, and it's not a one size fits all. And the articles on how to start a startup are mostly written by VCs themselves, and there should be other models explored. But Ample did not figure out how to resource itself to be successful, and it's made me think a lot more on what are the what are the potential compromises that could allow things like Ample to not just be like cute protest projects, but be real and competitive and make people like Patreon be fearful.
Hmm.
And so there still is no answer to this, but it's why I've been personally interested in Web3 as like ways to exploring various community token applications. I think there's ways to keep collective ownership, collective governance, while more creatively finding ways to resource works. And do VCs have a role in that? I think opening the window for some involvement, like, might not be the worst thing. I
Hmm.
think too much of any form of financing outside of just revenue is going to be bad.
Hmm.
Anyways, if you have too much debt, that
Hmm.
creates an issue. So yeah, I still think that's what I find exciting about so many Web3 based organizations now is there's this exploration of there's an excitement around collective governance, which is like energizes me. There's real kind of explorations on what an exit to community can look
Hmm.
like, often in the form of very imperfect airdrop based token distributions, but like still, I think there's a lot to learn from many of these examples. And then like more capital to fund creative communities is a good thing. Like starting Ample, I 1 year where I got paid $12,000 total. There was times where I even felt food insecure, but was just like
Hmm.
kept pushing through. And like the like personal pain and I had to go through to even just get that off the ground is something that I really don't want other people to have to do. For people that may have less privilege or it's like just more difficult to even think about stomaching something like that, just like sustained pain and hardship. Like it should be easier. We should find ways that people don't have to martyr themselves to make equitable organizations.
Hmm.
And I don't know, like we don't have all these answers yet, but at this point, I actually am much more open to seeing where are the compromises and what's important and what are like the flexible models of organizational design that we could play with. So I'm definitely at this point I'm not a co-op maximalist. I think there should be more co-ops. I love co-ops, but I think there can be many different shades of collective ownership and many different shades of collective governance. And I think in general, those are things to say yes to. And it's not something that's should be thought of as like a co-op as like an ideologically pure version of it. I think like what we want is we just if you like cooperatives, then you agree that collective ownership is a good thing and you want to see more of that.
Hmm.
You want more people to capture value they create. And so to me, it's less about the model itself and more about what the model allows people to do and how can we maximize that.
Could you talk about some of the examples that you've seen maybe over the past year of some flexible models that have been done well?
I think given imperfections, I think Friends with Benefits is
Hmm.
very interesting. A model with a lot of engaged people talking about governance, an incredible amount of transparency, voting on budgets, and actually shipping creative work together, throwing a really amazing festival, and having a lot of really cool, amazing people working on it. I think that's one example. I think examples like I think ENS airdropping tokens or Optimism dropping tokens, some of the protocol examples are also interesting just to see how they've communicated this like this sharing of ownership and both of those models have ways to delegate
Hmm.
so it's that like less direct democracy I think is probably more reasonable, and rather than everyone voting on everything. Yeah, so I think like some of the protocol based airdrops where like a token is a proxy for ownership is interesting to me. Yeah, ways that groups give other people ways to earn their way in is interesting. I also just think like there's an element of the nouns DAO model, which is interesting as well. You could also point out things that are imperfect about it, but creating a means to resource the group, having the nouns protocol, which is, I don't really care for the auction model being the center of everything, but having a kind of like token equals a membership pass or like a claim to a shared treasury that you work together on producing work
Mm.
together to advance X cause or X point of view. I think that's interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your earlier point, I think what friends with benefits ultimately did in flipping the script on the traditional way that companies try to get venture capital, and instead of going out and trying to get it themselves, they actually were able to build a community first. And this is they also flipped the script, I think, on product building as well in the same way, is that they organized the community around a vision and created a culture that had inherent value. And because of that value, they were able to decide which products they should build that can create additional value for this community, and they were able to utilize that value in order to attract venture capital to them and then do it on their own terms, which is a really interesting model to explore and a really interesting organizing principle.
Yeah, I think maybe Friends with Benefits probably took too much venture capital, and but I could see how these things are can be seductive. And you could argue that any community that has a token is also indirectly reliant on speculation.
Mm,
I guess the really complex thing is how to dance with that
right.
and how to use it towards a benefit that's not toxic or just purely financial in nature. I think of like biological systems as having different kinds of agents in any kind of an ant colony. It's like you can't have all ants doing one type of job,
Mm,
then the colony doesn't function. And if there's too much financialization, then that doesn't function, it breaks down. But I've just seen firsthand it also breaking down when there's like an absence of any financialization.
mm,
And so that's the point of view that I come from with Ample and just trying to, at this point, just thinking about how to thread the needle. Like, how can we maintain the integrity of a cooperative, but give it the resources it needs to be really powerful? And then figuring out ways that different kind of stakeholders within an ecosystem can all power that together. It's like
mm,
really not an easy answer, but the reason why I've been attracted to the Web3 space because there's so much awful, annoying, cringe stuff in crypto, but like there is enough signal there that you could point to and be like, there are interesting lessons to take from. There's one element of one project that has done
mm,
something interesting and
mm,
another element of another project. And I see groups that have combined things in different ways, and you could just treat it as like a sandbox for organizational design. And I just don't, if you're interested in collective ownership, I just don't see why you wouldn't want to start building and playing in this sandbox where there's just so many possibilities for how you can build an organization.
totally. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that within the context of Metalabel and what you're doing there, the work that you're doing there, and creating a sandbox for all these different organizations to come to discover what works for them.
So I'm part of a squad of 6 people working on Metalabel, and how I would define, there's like an organization that I'm a part of, which is like capital M Metalabel, and we've also articulated this concept of a Metalabel, like a lowercase m Metalabel, as a group of people that come together and release work to promote a common kind of cultural point of view. A group that kind of, at its core, has a cultural bottom line, an aesthetic bottom line, and a point of view to advocate. And what we are building is infrastructure for groups of people to come together and release work together. So I see this as like, we are believers in collective ownership. We are believers in collective governance. And we are taking our time to develop and design our own kind of expression of this, but also are building infrastructure for all kinds of groups to get together and release work together. And I see, like, in the context of DAOs or more online based collectives, that there's such a focus on treasury, like building a treasury. But then what do you do with that? So we want to build a very rich experience where how groups actually release and contextualize work and think about not only the context of the work itself, but how that work fits within a broader catalog of work. So I would see us as like building tools for any kind of online collective. And we're probably not as opinionated on how those groups form or operate, whether it's one person really leading or curating things. We're not really that opinionated about that, but are very opinionated about seeing a world where creativity is more multiplayer, where people come together in groups that are formal, informal, permanent, ephemeral, to create meaningful work together. And just as finding financial resources to create organizations that might not have a clear answer for financial return, we're thinking about that as building ways to support projects that might not have a clear financial return. If you're launching something that really promotes a kind of worldview or like a concept, say all of our releases promote this idea of creativity in multiplayer mode. And I think there should be more ways to support kind of ideas that are non-financialized at its core. So maybe that's one of the more, maybe that's a common thread in one way. It's hard to launch organizations that may not have a clear financial bottom line. I think of Ampled as like an organization that more had like a cultural bottom line to serve, like changing people's minds about things. And that's something that Metalabel like seeks to serve, is like these kinds of projects and releases that are really more about communicating something rather than like capturing financial value in all cases, but ways to resource those and ways to resource new groups and cultural collectives.
Cool. No, I love that. I love that. And I think that feels like a good spot to end. I just have one more question for you. I ask everybody this, but put you on the spot a little bit. You're going to a desert island, you get to bring 3 albums with you. What are they?
Oh man. I would bring Milo Goes to College by Descendants. I would bring probably Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by Smashing Pumpkins.
Nice.
I would bring Boys and Girls in America by The Hold Steady.
Cool. Oh man, the Hold Steady. I haven't listened to them in a while. I need to put them on after this. Cool. Thanks so much, Austin. It's been great having you here. If you could just let people know how they could get involved or follow along with the work that you're doing yourself at Metalabel and otherwise.
I have no Substack. There's Twitter. You can check out. I'd say follow Metalabel on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter if you're on it, and or just email me. Just austin@metalabel.xyz.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks again, Austin. It's been really great having you here. Great conversation as always.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, that's it for this episode of Big Brother and the Hodling Company. I'm your host, McKeegan Voice, and you can keep up with me and all the latest Web3 music trends on Twitter at McKeegan. That's MACEAGON. This show is a production of Decentral Media, and you can visit us at decentral.io, and remember, only you can prevent and fend off Big Brother.